Earlier this month, President Trump signed an executive order that proposed cutting the prices of pharmaceutical drugs. The executive order says that within 30 days, the administration would communicate desired target prices for pharmaceuticals to drug makers, and that it would seek to ensure that Americans pay no more for prescription drugs than the lowest price paid by other developed nations. But how would this executive order take shape? And how could the pharmaceutical industry be affected? To discuss, we welcome Dr. Tyler Varisco. He is an assistant professor of pharmaceutical health outcomes and policy at the University of Houston. Dr. Varisco, thank you so much for joining us on Hello Houston.
Thank you very much for having me.
So why don't we just begin with, healthcare as a free market good? Let's just open it up like that.
Yeah. So a lot of the progress proposed by this executive order seems to sort of spring from the fact that we can sort of as consumers demand certain pricing for the goods that we purchase. And that's really not how a free market works, in that, we can't just demand a price as consumers and then expect the producers to meet that price. But at the same time, medication and healthcare in general has never been a free market. A free market demands that everybody, the buyer and the seller, understands how the good is priced. And we really have no idea as general healthcare consumers of how healthcare is priced. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's worked in healthcare for a really long time, I don't even understand how healthcare is priced.
It's
right?
crazy.
It's very, very confusing. And medications in particular are particularly confusing in that when you Google the price of a drug and you go to the GoodRx website, or you even find a price that's in Redbook or one of the other federal pricing sources, that's rarely the price that pharmacies and other components of the health system are paying for that medication. And this comes back to a really complicated system of rebates on pharmaceutical prices. So about 50 cents of every dollar we spend on medication goes to a prescription benefit manager, a middleman, essentially. And some of that 50 cents also goes to a pharmaceutical wholesaler. And so what do manufacturers do? They raise the list price of drugs, both in the U.S. market and abroad, because they know that what they're going to have to pay to those middlemen to get their product on those formularies is going to be reflected in the price that's ultimately listed. So pharmaceutical manufacturers often list higher prices than are actually paid by the insurance companies, by the health systems, and by the pharmacies as well. And so we really don't have a good finger on the pulse of drug pricing in this country as it is.
Being the negative Nancy at this table on this whole
Sure.
thing. So I hear the president make his announcement, and all this is going to be great for lowering drug prices. But if I listen between the lines, it could also be interpreted, and tell me where I'm wrong here, that actually what we would do is raise the prices overseas. It's not necessarily bring us down, make theirs more expensive, and then we're all paying the same again. Am I looking at this wrong?
I'm going to be the more negative Nancy here.
Oh, even more. Join me.
I would go ahead and give you a fun statistic. About 70% of pharmaceutical profits come from the U.S. market across the industry. If I were a pharmaceutical company right now and I had to choose between staying in the U.S. market and continuing to profit from the U.S. market and pulling out of a foreign market that is using an antiquated or value-based pricing structure, I would pull out of the foreign market. I would just abandon those foreign markets altogether to maintain my footprint in the U.S., to remove that comparative perspective and just say, look, we don't sell in that market. This is what the drug costs.
So not only could it keep our prices the same or higher, it could take away service to other countries.
I agree, yes.
So I have a question. Let's say you have drug A on the market, but then there's drug B and C and D you're trying to develop that's costing billions of dollars that might not ever get into the marketplace. Somebody's got to pay for that development, and that's you and me.
Yeah.
So I understand
Right.
that's kind of fair.
So we are.
Is it though?
Well,
If companies, and I'll let the actual guest
Is
answer.
it though?
And you
if
can call me
companies-
Friendly Frank. I don't know what we call Celeste.
If companies,
Ooh.
though, weren't making billions in profit, I would agree with you,
Well,
because then they'd be
let the good
The
doctor speak to
expert
this.
speak.
so it's
Ernie?
this is a really complicated argument, and it is an argument that comes from the pharma playbook. And I'm not a pharma apologist by any means. My research is not supported by the industry, and really, I historically have been probably more critical on profitability in the pharmaceutical manufacturer space. But that being said, you are correct that we feel in the U.S. as if we must pay for the price of innovation. And that is reflected to some extent. We do get to benefit from a lot of new products that come to market, particularly in cancer care and in other more cutting-edge areas of innovation. And this would certainly impact the impetus of pharmaceutical manufacturers to continue innovating in that space. I'm not going to argue with that at all. But where I think the risk here is that, yes, they stop producing new drugs, or they find new ways to shoulder that risk or try to defer development internationally to other developed countries. And if that were to happen, pricing would still be reflected in the U.S. because, again, we're benchmarking development costs against other countries. So I could see this spinning toward less investment in U.S. biotech and more investment in biotech overseas and more investment in research overseas as well.
We're speaking with Dr. Tyler Varisco, an assistant professor of pharmaceutical health outcomes and policy at the University of Houston. You can join the conversation at 713-440-8870. We did have a YouTube question here from Chris Galvan, Dr. Varisco. He says, what should one consider before using services like GoodRx? For example, buying drugs using GoodRx might not count towards a deductible.
That is a very good point. Yeah. So purchasing medication using GoodRx would not count for towards a deductible. That being said, in a lot of pharmacies in the United States, the pharmacy itself is not really making a lot of money from your insurance company. Reimbursement has fallen dramatically over the last several years since we've really brought a lot of the pharmaceutical benefit managers into the market space. And because of that, a lot of community pharmacies are oftentimes losing money on medications that are reimbursed through prescription insurance, particularly generic or maintenance medications. Sometimes it's worth asking that pharmacy what the plain cash price would be for that medication, because it may actually be cheaper than the price that's listed on GoodRx, or even lower than your copay. So it's always worth asking if it's, a generic medication that you're using for a chronic condition.
Let me stay with GoodRx for a moment here, and that kind of whole programs that are out there. It's not just GoodRx. So I look at a particular drug, and I know with my insurance, where I regularly go, it's this much. But if I don't use my insurance, or use my insurance and I go somewhere else, it's drastically less in the U.S. How does this all work? Isn't there a cost for the medication that they are selling to the pharmacies, and then the pharmacies put whatever markup? But I doubt these markups are either $1 here or $53 there. Why the inconsistencies?
That's a great question. The pharmaceutical supply chain is very, very complicated, so I'm just going to start off by saying that. But in short, the way that we price drugs on the U.S. is very, very fragmented, in where one pharmacy may pay a certain amount for one medication, another pharmacy may pay a slightly different amount for that same medication, and then each insurance company is working with a sort of a middleman, a pharmaceutical benefit manager, who also sort of provides pricing or reimbursement to that pharmacy based on what they've negotiated with the insurance plan on the other end. So because of all of those steps, each pharmacy can have slightly different prices because of where they're purchasing.
Slightly, though.
Very different prices.
Massively different.
Very different prices based on where they're purchasing their drugs from. Their purchasing power as a pharmacy. So a small pharmacy has less purchasing power than a large pharmacy. Different wholesalers are acquiring from different manufacturers at different prices. And then the PBMs, the pharmaceutical benefit managers, have their own pricing models and their own negotiations with the manufacturers. And a lot of their pricing with the manufacturer is based on the system of rebates, where they say, we will prefer the drug that you manufacture for this disease or this indication. And in exchange, you will pay us a rebate at the end of the year based on how much volume of that medication we are able to dispense to our beneficiaries. So that has a lot of impact on pricing.
And will you address the fact that I guess some doctors are encouraged to prescribe certain medicines by those representing those medicines?
Yeah, and if you want me to make a moral judgment on that, I don't think it's the best model in the world, right? But at the end of the day, how are we supposed to communicate what's new, right? Your average small town family doctor, right? Or your average general surgeon, maybe not in the medical center, but in a non-academic setting, how do they know what's new?
Well, if it's a legitimate recommendation, great.
Right.
But if it's, we're going to have a conference in Hawaii to talk
that's
about
the
this,
issue.
and we want to invite you out there to learn more about our drug.
But
That's
even worse
different.
than that,
Yeah.
you prescribe our drug and you get a kickback of so much.
Okay, that was
And
where I
that
was going. But
Well-
sorry, yeah.
So marketing has changed, and the things that you're describing are not necessarily legal anymore. And now they do happen in some form. Pharmaceutical companies can still host educational events or contribute to medical conferences, right? And that is a form of advertising. But pharmaceutical companies are a business, and businesses do need to advertise. I'm, again, not an apologist, but let me add one more thing onto that. The bigger concern to me is direct-to-consumer advertising. We are one of two countries in the world where pharmaceutical companies can advertise directly to patients who then find out about all sorts of things that they think they may need. I mean, you can't watch a football game without seeing 10 commercials for Ozempic anymore, right? That is driving up demand for these products, these very expensive products. And what do patients do? They walk into their doctor's office, they demand that drug. The insurance company is now having to pay for that because the doctor has prescribed it, right? And now we're driving up prices because, again, the demand is there, and that demand is generated by advertising.
how do you feel about Eli Lilly coming in and saying, we've created this demand so high we can't fill it,
Yeah.
and so compound pharmacies are filling it, and now they're saying, okay, we can fill it now. You compound pharmacies that are doing it for half price need to stop.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. I am a proud former independent pharmacist, and compounding pharmacies do have
Thank
a very
you for your work.
Sure. Still very proud to work with the National Community Pharmacists Association on a lot of the work that we do here. But regardless, there needs to be something in between there, right? Like just putting the kibosh on compounding when patients really can't obtain these medications, that is an issue. I mean, and some of that goes back to, again, having providers check expectations at the door. Let's try a diet, let's try some exercise, let's try some health lifestyle modifications, and then we can talk about one of these drugs. Let's get some guidance, some evidence-based guidance from the Endocrinology Society, from other organizations to sort of weigh in on this issue before making it a regulatory and manufacturer problem. So I don't know if I totally agree with suspending compounding of these agents, but one thing I will say is that there have been instances of patients being harmed because there is such a rush to provide these products from these med spas and other outlets that a lot of the time the education is not there, the quality control is not there, and then patients are giving themselves very large doses because they're not taught how to inject semaglutide or other products, and there is risk there. And so I'm okay with compounding, but at the same time, we have to be cautious with how new drugs are rolled out, and it can't always be the patient demanding a drug.
And
there has to be a healthcare professional and evidence
Speaking
there.
of new products coming out, if I remember correctly, it was 3 years after you release it into the marketplace that then a generic can be formulated. Does that still exist? Am I off on my years?
Yeah, so the number of years is it varies, I will say, and I think if I remember correctly, patent exclusivity is something like 9 to 11 years. That being said, there's a ton of tools in the pharma toolbox to keep a drug brand for a very long time.
One molecule.
Yeah, so slight modifications, change to the salt or something. There's also been a lot of instances, particularly with some of these newer biologic drugs, of the manufacturer challenging the fidelity of the biosimilar product to their product. And so there are a lot of extensive regulatory requirements there for some of our more expensive biologic drugs. But even for oral medications, pharmaceutical companies can come in and say, look, that generic, it doesn't dissolve at the same rate. It's not absorbed at the same rate. So it's not identical. And that causes the FDA to suspend that generic from reaching the market. The other new thing, too, a lot of manufacturers will change route of administration. Look at some of the semaglutide products. Oh, you've heard of the injectable. Now we have an oral, right? And so we've got Rybelsus. We've got these other products on the market that are the same molecule, formulated differently to be taken differently, and that, again, extends the exclusivity of the original manufacturer.
So, Dr. Varisco, speaking of the executive order that was proposed by President Trump about cutting the prices of pharmaceutical drugs, what do you think people should know and be aware of about this executive order and what they can expect?
To be entirely honest with you,
Always.
I think what the average American healthcare consumer should expect is absolutely nothing for a long time. I don't think that implementing this order is practical. I expect there to be months, if not years, of legal challenges from the pharmaceutical industry. There's language in there about direct-to-consumer purchase of medications from the manufacturer. I can't think of a single state in the U.S. where that is legal.
Well, and to your point, I think it's politically based.
It is.
I'm going to tell the pharmacies to cut those prices, the drug manufacturers to cut those prices. If we're going to demand that, then the government should pay for it.
So you bring up a really good point. Why are drugs so much cheaper in other countries than they are in the U.S.? Because I don't think we've really addressed that. The way to lower pharmaceutical prices most effectively is to increase the buying power of a population. If I'm the UK and we have a single payer, and I'm not necessarily advocating for single payers, but if I have a single payer, then, we've got one entity that can bargain with the manufacturer for a lower price for that drug product.
For lack of a better term, socialized medicine.
That is a word that people use. Yeah. So,
single payer gets confusing. The single payer is socialized medicine.
That means the government buys it.
Right. But then you've got countries like Germany, right, where we don't necessarily have a single payer. We have private health plans, but they're very regulated. They all generally pay for care at about the same price. And because of that, again, there's more unified bargaining across the insurance space. So if the insurance companies are all kind of on the same page instead of all trying to compete with each other for lower pricing and better rebates, then we can kind of move in mass to negotiate those prices down.
Which is better for pharmaceutical companies, single payer or double, triple payer, or what we're doing in America right now?
I think what probably works out better for pharmaceutical companies, and certainly if not pharmaceutical companies, for prescription benefit managers, who I think are a big source of the problem here, what works out better is a very fragmented system.
Which is what we have.
Where we have confidentiality agreements in place and we can keep payers blinded to the negotiation activity of each other. And because of that, we can sort of work out a deal that works out optimally for us as the manufacturer and works out well for the payer, keeping prices relatively high.
Now, something I'm seeing here on our YouTube comments is somebody says, now that Medicare has been allowed to negotiate on some drugs, should we see the prices come down for everyone? Dr. Varisco, how will this and is this at all going to affect Medicaid and Medicare?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So the Medicare, I'm going to address that first. So we're talking about negotiation through the Inflation Reduction Act program, which would allow CMS to negotiate the prices of, I believe, 10 drugs a year and to expand that tranche every year to a new tranche of drugs, rather. I think that the IRA model is quite sensible in that it's not this big sweeping cut. And one thing about the Trump administration is we seem to want to, fix the problem with one executive order and just assume that that's going to work out. But the IRA negotiation is pulsed, where we're going to do 10 drugs a year, allowing the manufacturers, allowing the insurance plans that manage those Medicare beneficiaries to sort of adjust gradually to that change in pricing. That's a very sensible approach. And one giant cut is likely to just introduce dramatic disarray, dramatic legal challenges, everything that we've seen unfold so far. I'm particularly concerned about the executive order for favored nation pricing, in that almost simultaneously we're seeing massive restructuring to Medicaid plans, where we're instituting work requirements. We seem to be restricting services, restricting activities under the expansion from the ACA. We're really reframing federal investment in Medicaid. Mm-hmm. And I almost think that there's going to be this argument that, look, we're trying to reduce drug prices. That should lower Medicaid spending. And so we can make these cuts to Medicaid because they will be offset by the reductions in drug pricing from this other executive order. I don't think that's how insurance plans work. And I generally expect to see Medicaid benefits deteriorate in terms of quality of care that is paid for and delivered.
Dr. Tyler Varisco is an assistant professor of pharmaceutical health outcomes and policy at the University of Houston. Dr.